working as the region representative and technical specialist for Malaria Consortium. I will be the moderator of the day. We're giving a little bit of a rest to our moderator, very kind and brilliant moderator, Dr. Leo Barrick. So he will be having some relaxation today. Before we move on, first I would like to invite our chair of our APMEN VCWG, Dr. Rose, to give an opening remark. Dr. Rose, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tin. Very good, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the distinguished participants. Welcome to the 2021 APMEN Vector Control Working Group Annual Conference. So this is the day 4 of our conference. So I hope you all are well. Today's topic, we are going to discuss more on how can private sector be more effective, integrated towards speeding up the malaria eliminations. So we all know that how important that the private sector to be part of our team in the malaria elimination program. So today we are grateful because we have all the speakers that going to talk about this private sector involvement in the malaria elimination program. So without further ado, I think I give back this screen to Dr. Tin.
Thank you, Dr. Rose, for the opening remark. Today, we're very delighted to welcome returning as well as new participants, colleagues, a unique mix of country representatives and those from the partner institution, especially from the private sector and industry leaders as well. So today we'll be looking at a slightly different topic from the past first 3 days, yet another important one, which is, as Dr. Rose mentioned, how can private sector be more effectively integrated towards speeding up malaria elimination, of course, from the vector control point of views. Well, actually, this is not the first time the private sector topic is discussed in APMEN conferences and meetings and workshops. In fact, very recently, APMEN have launched a review on the private sector. So I just want to pick up where we left off in the 2020 annual meeting. So APMEN has launched this engaging private sector to eliminate malaria in Asia Pacific, a rapid review approaches. So the document aims to provide a framework for national malaria control programs to consider their own private sector engagement plan, appropriate to the country context and needs, and how they can use this public private sector partners to accelerate the malaria elimination efforts. So just a couple of remarks on the private sector's reflection on the recent events, of course. With the COVID-19 global response, we have seen unprecedented challenges with diagnostic, therapeutics, and now with the vaccine development and rollout. But in retrospect of these challenges have in fact turned into opportunities, and now we are seeing achievements. And when mankind is always challenged, we always look for solutions. So in thinking of that, putting that in perspective, how that could be also applied for malaria elimination to address the last mile challenges. So that's the one way to inspire everybody to stimulate the thoughts on that as well. Today we have a very packed agenda with the lineup of brilliant speakers from all the thought leaders in the private sectors and who have long experience working alongside countries and in making that the public health goods are delivered to the countries. On the screen that you're seeing, the documents, if you're interested to go further, read for the document in detail, please go to the link. As you're seeing on the screen, this is also being uploaded on OREEN website and also will be sent to you via emails as well. One of the things that we have learned from the earlier day, I would say on the day 1, it's really highlighting views from Dr. Stefan Karl about how current vector control tools and products, the LLINs in particular, These public goods are heavily relying on the international funding agencies. And if you think of a scenario when there's an absence of the funding programs, communities will not have continued access to these products, as you know, that are quality assured, effective, and efficacious too for prevention. And moreover, particularly in the Asia Pacific epidemiology and transmission setting, that calls for the needs for the new vector control tools to be developed, scale up, and introduced into the market and create access to the communities who are in need, such as how do we prevent outdoor transmission, for instance. It is clear that we're not be able to address the challenge alone. We need the private sector to be on our side, to be part of that solutions. So today, guided by this brilliant framework you have seen in this document, which put things into perspective, like how a country can approach private sector, how they can engage, given the different options in that. So on the different axes, you see financial support up to implement what type of implementing partners can do, and the mix of options we have laid out in that. So guided by this particular idea, we'll be zooming into how can we integrate more effectively of the private sector into vector control programs. So we have invited private sector industry leaders. First, you will hear some very thought-provoking presentations, and then the back-to-back 3 presentations. And in the afternoon, we will have a chance to go into breakout rooms. So we'll be switching from different platform webinar to meetings after the tea break. So in that Zoom breakout discussions, we'll be doing a deep dive discussion, knowing how to stimulate how we can get private sector get on board and how we can integrate into our national programs, plans, and strategies. So more details on the breakout discussions will be shared later on. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker of the day, who is Dr. Mark Hope. Mark is the chairman of Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. He's also a public health entomologist with 30 years of experience in research and development, advocacy in agriculture and public health at insect control. He is currently involved in development of novel solutions for control of insect of public health importance, working in Switzerland. So Mark will be presenting about a very good perspective and example from the industry point of view, supporting the battle against insecticides resistance in public health. So I would like to invite Dr. Mark to present his presentation. Dr. Mark, if you could turn on your video and audio, please.
It tells me I am unable to turn on my video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, sorry. Okay, you're back.
I'm here.
Can you see the presentation on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
So I can't see my presentation yet, but I can see a presentation.
Apologies. Can you see the presentation?
There we are.
All right.
Excellent. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. And can I thank the meeting chair and the conference organisers for inviting me and inviting IRAC to give this short presentation to you. Let's make that so I can read my own slides. So yes, that's been thank you very much. So firstly, I'd like to introduce the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, or IRAC. So IRAC was formed in 1984 and works as a specialist technical group of the industry association called CropLife, or CropLife International, which is the industry association of the agrochemical industry. Our mission is to facilitate communication and education on resistance to insecticides and insect-resistant traits, and to promote and facilitate development of and implementation of resistance management strategies to maintain efficiency and to support sustainable agriculture and improved public health. Next slide, please. Now, the public health team is mainly focused on the looking at insecticide resistance management in the control of mosquito vectors of disease. But we also have a wider remit to look at all insects of public health importance, but we mainly focus on Anopheles mosquitoes. Next slide, please. So why is industry interested in insecticide resistance management? Well, I think there are three reasons. The first is corporate social responsibility. Industry is part of society, and we need to act responsibly as part of society. And so I think there really is a responsibility on everyone, including industry, to act to the good of the whole of society. It's also for project stewardship reasons. We need to maintain our products in the market. A lot of these products are registered, rightly so, because they need to be used in the correct way. And so we need to make sure that we can keep them in the market through how we use them, how they're registered, etc. But also it makes good financial sense. Industry the aim of industry is to make money, is to reward the investors. And it can take over 10 years, and it can cost tens of millions of dollars to develop and register novel insecticides. And if they lose their efficacy quickly and they stop working because of resistance, then the companies selling it may not be able to cover their development costs. And they certainly won't be able to continue to be able to invest in the development of new products. So it makes good financial sense as well for us to be interested in resistance management. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background about insecticide resistance, and I don't think anyone is allowed to give a talk on resistance or insecticides in malaria control without quoting this very famous paper now from BAT that showed that between 2000 and 2015, it was estimated that 450 million cases of malaria had been averted as a result of pyrethroid-treated, long-lasting, insecticide-treated bed nets, which is an amazing number when you think about it. So any significant reduction in the efficacy of the long-lasting nets due to resistance in the mosquitoes could greatly impact these gains. So it really is potentially a large threat. Next slide, please. But is resistance really an issue? Well, one way to look at whether something is an issue is to see how many scientific papers have been published on a particular topic over the years. And I think the more papers are published in an area, the greater the concern or the interest amongst the academic community. And if we do a search for all scientific papers which contain the words insecticide resistance in mosquitoes, either in their title or abstract, and plot that against time, we can see that there really has been a significant increase, certainly since the 1990s. And whilst this slide is a few years out of date now, the numbers are just increasing almost exponentially. So clearly insecticide resistance in mosquitoes is a big problem. Next slide, please. But what exactly is resistance? I mean, there are a number of definitions that people use. IRAC has a definition which it's made. Now, this refers both to agricultural insect pests and public health vectors. And the IRAC definition is that resistance is a heritable change in the sensitivity of a pest population that is reflected in the repeated failure of a product to achieve the expected level of control when used according to the label recommendation for that pest species. Now, the interesting thing here is that when we look at mosquitoes or any insects really, mosquitoes don't become resistant to insecticides per se by themselves, but they can and they do become resistant to insecticide-based control interventions. So they become resistant to products that have been used rather than just insecticides that remain in a bottle somewhere. Now, am I just, twisting some words here? I think this is actually quite an important thing to think about, because what it shows us is that how we undertake vector control or how we undertake insect control impacts the development of resistance. And so there's something we can do there, because we are the ones undertaking the vector control. Next slide, please. But I think it's important not so much to think about insecticide resistance, but to think about insecticide susceptibility. And what I mean there is we should be thinking about the mosquitoes that can be controlled with the products we have today. And using the IRAC definition of resistance, the susceptibility of a mosquito population can change without it becoming resistant, because the product could still work, and yet they are becoming less susceptible to it. And the products still work because they're used at their full label rates, etc. Then they will almost certainly control them. But we need to understand changes in susceptibility, because that's the key to managing resistance. Because if we wait until we have resistance, it's probably too late. There's not much you can do. So if we, to identify a fire in our house, we use a smoke detector. We don't use a detector of big piles of ash. And I think that's how we should think about resistance monitoring as well. That resistance monitoring looks for the big pile of ash your house has already burnt down. We should be looking at susceptibility monitoring, which is the smoke detector. Next slide, please. So given time, I haven't got time to go through all the recommendations that IRAC makes on resistance management, but they're very much in line with those given by the World Health Organization in its GPERM document, for example, and they're based on rotations of insecticides, mosaics or mixtures of insecticides with different modes of action to which the target pest population is susceptible. And we also recommend monitoring the population regularly and also using an integrated vector management approach. Next slide, please. So I would encourage you to go to the IRAC website, which is iraconline.org, and you'll be able to find a number of other sources of information there. We've published some books, some booklets on the subject of resistance management in mosquito vectors of disease. We've produced some infographics or posters, which are, you can download. We also have an app which you can download to your phone, which will help to tell you which mode of action class an insecticide belongs to. And of course, we have the IRAC mode of action classification, which I haven't had time to describe, but that helps you to identify which insecticides work in the same way, and which is a very important step when undertaking resistance management. Next slide, please. And I'm going to put a very sneaky little ad in here, because IRAC is working with the Rollback Malaria Vector Control Workgroup to produce a MOOC. Now, what is a MOOC? It's a massive online open course on insecticide resistance management in mosquito vector control. And it is going to provide the theory and practice of IRM in an accessible and multimedia format. It will be free for anyone, anywhere in the world to participate via the FutureLearn platform. And whilst it will be based on a Sub-Saharan African context, the material is relevant for mosquito vector control activities everywhere. So please do watch out for further information on this. I think this is going to be a very valuable educational tool. So with that, I will ask for the last slide. And thank you for your attention. And just to point out, these are the member companies of CropLife.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations about the IRM. So we do have 5 minutes for Q&A. So if participants would like to ask live, please raise your hand. And if you feel more comfortable in asking through chats, please insert your questions in Q&A and I can ask on your behalf. So I think we have one asked by Dalia. This is, I think, more about your slides on the number of paper on the insecticide resistance, why there is no paper published in 2020. So if you would like to respond quickly, please, Mark.
So that's the chart which I believe you're referring to only goes up to 2010. And that's when the analysis was done a few years after that. So we need to update that slide to include the papers that have been published in the last 8 or 9 years. So that's why you won't see more recent data.
Thank you very much, Mark. And we have one participant, Dr. Sharma. Would you like to ask, sir? Please unmute yourself, Dr. Sharma.
So thank you
Dr.
very
Sharma,
much.
please.
So now role of private partners in the field of alternative insecticides as well as resistance management. So question is, last so many years there is no new molecule developed by private sectors, and if they have developed, that is under some regulatory authorities, so it will take 5-6 years. A new molecule particularly come to national malaria control programs. So when there is no new molecule available with the national malaria control program, so how this resistance management is possible? 1, 2. This yes, this is development of new molecule takes time by our private friends, private partner friends. So how we will achieve elimination with the existing this vector control interventions?
So I think I'll try to answer your questions there. So I think at the moment there are very few insecticide mode of action classes that are registered for use against vectors, and so it is very difficult to undertake a good rotation strategy. However, there are several, and you should be planning to rotate between them where possible and logistically feasible. There are also other steps that can be done to support resistance management, and I would encourage you to look at some of the material that was promoted there. As for how long it takes to develop new insecticides, it does take a long time, but there are new insecticides that are being developed at the moment for this market. And I hope that some of them will be available for use in the next 2 or 3 years. And so it's important that we have resistance management best practice in place now, so that when they are used, we can maintain their efficacy for as long as possible. So I hope that's answered your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Thank you, Dr. Mark. We have one more question for you, Mark. What are the efforts toward developing for a new mode of action?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the beginning of that question.
What are efforts toward developing the new mode of actions? I think it's asking for new mode of actions products and what efforts has been put already.
So as I said, there are a number of the large insecticide producing companies are working on developing new products. At the moment, they will be sort of commercially secret, so I can't tell you because I'm not aware of what they all are myself, if the competitors are working. But they are being very ably supported by organisations such as the IVCC, the Innovative Vector Control Consortium, have played a key part in this activity. And so a number of these companies have undertaken a very large exercise to review both the insecticides they sell in agriculture, but also go back through their large collections of chemicals to try and find those that have exactly the right properties for use against mosquitoes. So I'm fairly confident there will be new products coming to the market over the next few years.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe we only have one more time for one more comment only. So I just picked up one from the chat. Interestingly so, because it's something that we have been hearing quite a lot about the public feedback on the nets that have been produced, manufactured and distributed in countries. One of our participants asked, like, mosquitoes still fly through the nets, probably referring to the size of the hole. So there's certain feedback that community want to provide to manufacture. He was referring to how can we conduct this kind of a study setting, or is there any funding available for a country to conduct a study? So I think it will be good to hear from private sector perspective if they are eager to hear that kind of feedback from the beneficiaries, making sure there's community adoption is better, the product is more relevant to the needs. So what do you see the private sector would have mechanism to collect the kind of feedback from the people?
That's a very good point. One of the differences between the sort of mosquito net market and normal markets for sort of consumer goods is that it's very much a tender market, and so a tender is put out for nets that meet a certain specification, and that will often be that they have listing under the WHO pre-qualification, for example, and that they meet certain specifications. And then any net that meets that specification, then the purchaser will decide amongst those. So there isn't the sort of the classic demand from the actual end user, the person who benefits from the net. That information, it doesn't come back quite so easily. So I think it's a really good idea that information should come back, because that will enable nets that are more appropriate to be produced. They're therefore more likely to be used properly, more likely to be looked after, etc. And so I think that is, it would be very valuable for that to happen. And there are a number of universities, etc., who have undertaken studies on that. So I think, yes, please, if there is that sort of information, please to try and feed it back.
Thank you, Mark. So please don't go away yet. So there are still questions coming in the Q&A box. So if you could go through the questions, you can also answer them by typing in. And I would also encourage colleagues to put your questions in the chat in the Q&A box if you could, because we'll have more organized way to respond to those questions. So thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation. So for next, I would like to invite another speaker, Angus Spears, who is the Director of Innovation to Impact I2I in the UK. Angus has worked for almost 20 years in planning, development, implementing malaria and child programs throughout Africa and Southeast Asia. His work has taken him from emergency response in Sierra Leone, Liberia, to Angola, where he led to establishment of the President Malaria Initiative in the country before joining UNICEF as the regional malaria advisor in Kenya. So Angus will present about on the critical barriers to bridge for the new vector control tools. This perspective is important for us to give fundamental understanding of these barriers and how we can support the private sector and country can support each other to make the partnerships more effective. So over to you, Angus. Thank you for joining with us.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Can you hear me okay and see the slide on the screen?
Yes, we can hear you and slides are okay.
Great. Okay, so again, thank you for inviting me to speak here, and shame we can't be there in person, but hopefully next year. But yeah, so I'm going to talk just quickly about some of the barriers as we see it for or overcoming some of the barriers as we see it for access to new vector control tools to the market. And this is based on a lot of the work that we at I2I have been doing, and I'll caveat it now by saying it is quite focused on Africa, where we have been working primarily, but I think there are some takeaways here about the product development ecosystem as a whole that I think are relevant to wherever in the world we are working. I'll also give you another caveat in saying that this process or this talk is going to be focused very much on the pre-qualification pathway around from WHO, which is really looking at the safety, quality, and entomological efficacy of new vector control tools, rather than the new intervention pathway around development of policy and normative guidance from WHO, which is a whole different set of issues and requirements, which I think would take for a longer presentation, but also a crucial part of the product development process. Just in terms of where we are now from my perspective, I mean, we have the WHO pre-qualification vector control process established. This has been set up in the last 5 years or so. I2I was quite heavily involved in the support to do that. But that process is now established. It has replaced the HOOPES process program at WHO and is already evaluating and listing products. Most of the HOOPES products, all of the HOOPES products have transitioned across to pre-qualification, and we're already seeing next generation products, particularly IRS and ITNs, in use in countries. So the process is actually working, is getting products through, and is evaluating new product classes as well. To support this as well, we have there's been a lot of support for developing GLP test facility capacity, because pre-qualification requires GLP data for the product dossiers. And this process is still ongoing, and some of you will be involved in that in the WHO NTD supported sites in the Asia Pacific. But that system is now in place and generating data as well. So there's a lot that's been done in the last few years in the ecosystem around product evaluation. But I would posit that ecosystem is still somewhat rooted in the past in terms of how it operates and the ways that it works in some respects. For one thing, I think there's still a limited knowledge of the pre-qualification process at country level. HOOPES was around for over 50 years and obviously casts a long shadow. And certainly when we've talked to regulators and implementers in Sub-Saharan Africa, knowledge of pre-qualification is pretty low, and in terms of what it entails and how it differs from this process before that went before. I think that said, I think we're missing opportunities to embrace the strengths of the new pre-qualification process, and certainly around their flexibility for new methods and developing new methods, which I think underpins a lot of the innovation that we're looking for in the market, because it allows you to identify and describe different entomological effects and new product classes. And that method development needs to be done proactively rather than reactively, as we're seeing now with products on the market, and we're sort of working out how best to bioassay them or to do that consistently. And that really needs to be something that is done during the evaluation process. And I think as well, what we need to see more of is some of these pre-qualification outputs being used more consistently by stakeholders. And I'm not pointing fingers at any particular group here, but they are churning out decision documents, guidelines, this kind of thing, which even if a product or a country may not use pre-qualification in its decision making, can provide really crucial information to about the evaluation and the products themselves to help decision making in a country. So with all that said, I mean, really what I think we need to be doing is better harnessing the opportunities of the PQ vector control process. And to visualize that, I developed this hopefully useful diagram, but really it's a notion that the product development or the evaluation system is still maturing, and I think we can see that we don't have validated methods for certain tools and for certain entomological effects, and the pre-qualification process is not understood. So I would argue that scientific inputs are not always focused on getting the product evaluated, and that really doesn't help with the data generation. And we still see a lot of siloing in data generation. The product developer is responsible for this, obviously, and I'm not pointing fingers at the product developers. I think they're responding to the system that's put in front of them. But working with GLP sites, working with country regulators and WHOPQ, there can be a separate set of demands for each of these groups, which can confuse data generation, and certainly we'll go into a little more detail, particularly around country registration, that has proven to be very challenging, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. And obviously this will lead to delayed decision making at the country, regional, pre-qualification level, and hinder access to these new products. Obviously very simplified. Obviously there's a lot more components to it, but these are the ones that I'm going to focus on a little bit today. If I go to the next slide. So when I think a lot of this is underpinned by updating the data requirements for the evidence generation, and this is something that pre-qualification is working on with the product developers. We facilitate an industry work stream which is independently chaired, but is really acting as a sounding board for the pre-qualification team to interact with the industry and discuss new policy developments and new approaches that they are considering to get the consolidated industry feedback. And so one of the items on the agenda in our upcoming meeting in June is going to be around updated data requirements and indicators. And so with this, I think we can have clearer product specifications if you've got the actual methods to underline the endpoints that you're looking at, and we need to focus this evidence generation around need to know data. I still see and get a sense that there is a lot of nice to know data that is being generated because of the opportunity given by actually having a product being tested. But some of this data is not needed for for a regulatory or a pre-qualification decision, and it sort of bloats and loads onto surveys which should be focused on product access rather than all sorts of other different questions that may come up from the opportunity of having the products. And I really think there needs to be a focusing around evidence generation to focus on access rather than a lot of this nice to know information that may not help with the access issues. A big part of what we're focusing on as well is around in methods and making sure that they're fit for purpose. Many people are comfortable with the standard bioassays, cone test, tunnel test, for example, that are used for evaluation of vector control tools, particularly pyrethroids or pyrethroid-like active ingredients, but they're really not standing up for AIs with different modes of action or different entomological effects. And we need to make sure that we are validating methods that actually describe the effect of the product and the active ingredients, and do that consistently, so that data can be compared between facilities and sites, and it makes it easier to interpret the data that's coming out of these studies. And that's something, like I said, that has been done rather reactively at present, but needs to be thought of proactively as the product is being developed and evaluated, so that we don't have products waiting to get onto the market and no way to analyze their performance when they get there. I think as well, a big issue that we've seen is alignment of data requirements, particularly between the, let's say, global, regional, and country levels. And I'll show you some information from a study we did a couple of years ago now in Africa, which just sort of highlights the issue. But the notion that the pre-qualification not being understood in many countries, or not being really fully grasped in many countries, is can lead to parallel data generation. It can lead to data being generated in certain places and not recognized by regulators in those countries because it wasn't done under the auspices of those regulators. So you get duplication of data being generated, and all of this leads to cost, delay, and and a certain degree of frustration from all sides in the evaluation process. So I think we need to recognize that unlike many medical products, vector control products can be evaluated by a number of different ministries or regulatory bodies, not always the Ministry of Health, and those different regulatory bodies often have different lenses through which they make decisions. And so data requirements can be quite varied in many cases, and for example, sometimes focus more on crop science than on disease control. And I would say as well, a lot of the countries that we looked at, the requirements are still based around HOOPI's data requirements and don't reflect the pre-qualification dossiers that are coming out. I think there's a lot we can do there to bridge that gap and use this more complete and regulatory type dossier that pre-qualification produces to help inform country decision making. So, I think there's a real need here to recognise that sovereignty of decision making at country is, has to be respected. But there's a lot we can do around consistent data requirements and alignment of data requirements, so that product developers and their research partners can streamline the data generation and don't have to duplicate science and evidence for various different purposes. And just as an illustration of this, I'm going to show you just the very headlines of a study we did. This is now a couple of years old, but this really just shows the patchwork of different regulatory authorities in Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that about just under half of these regulators are based in the Ministry of Health. In some countries, you have 2, or in a couple, even 3 regulators of vector control tools, depending on what the tool is. And so each might have different data requirements for products going in there. We also have the Ministries of Environment involved in some countries, and Ministry of Agriculture. And I think there's recognizing that that these different decision-making lenses exist, I think is a really important step to understanding how far we need to outreach to regulators and decision makers at country, particularly where they're not in the Ministry of Health, because I think ministries of health have been reached very effectively over the years around disease control for malaria, rollback malaria, for example. The focus is quite obviously on ministries of health, national malaria control programs, but where some of these decisions in countries are being made by ministries of agriculture and environment, I think we can do a better job of reaching out to those groups to include them into some of the information sharing and the decision making at country level. In terms of data requirements, this slide just really shows a highlight of some of the countries that we actually did a deep dive in, and you can see the lighter colours being total reliance on foreign or outside data sources, all the way to the darkest colour.
Hi Angus. I think we need to wrap up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is my last slide.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. So yes. Anyway, there's a patchwork of different data requirements, and I think when you add all this together, you can see that there's a lot of different considerations that need to be undertaken to how you generate data, for what purposes, and for the different people, which can obviously add to cost, timelines, and delays at country level. So hopefully we can reach something more like this in the future, where we have a robust evaluation framework that is clearly understood by all parties who are involved in it. We have optimized evaluation science, where I think there's more data visibility between the key players within that data generation, and hopefully leading to faster adoption in endemic countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angus, for your presentation. It really on point on a certain opportunity that for room for improvement in terms of streamlining these the data generation processes, and that will ultimately help the product pre-qualification process bit more efficient. So thank you very much for your presentations, very insightful. I hope our National Malaria Control Program partners are listening in, and in the breakout discussions, maybe share their insights and perspective on some of the points that have been raised in Angus' presentations, how we can focus on improvement. So in the interest of time, we might not be able to allocate for question and answer for Angus' presentation, but I do encourage participants to go into the Q&A box and insert your questions there, and I hope Angus will answer them offline, after this his presentation, so that we can keep the dialogue flowing. So for the next presenter, I would like to invite, thank you so much, Angus, for your time. For next, I would like to invite Justin McBee. Justin is the Global Market Manager, Vector Control for Bayer, with overall responsibility for global portfolio strategy. He has worked in Vector Control at Bayer in one function or another for the past 20 years, with experience in product development, regulatory affairs, and commercial business management for vector control products in the Pacific region as well, while living in Australia. So he brought a wealth of knowledge on the of course, in the issues that we have already discussed, and he will also give us a perspective on what is the current role of private sector, what are the shortfall in delaying elimination, and is there opportunities for expanded role by the private sector to engage in the malaria elimination objective. So thank you so much for joining us, Justin, and we look forward to hear your presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So first of all, thank you for the to the APMEN Secretariat for this opportunity to join this meeting and to be one of the panelists and share some thoughts with you. Will you be sharing slides your end, Tim? I can't see anything yet.
Sorry, I will do that. Sorry.
So as just mentioned, there's 3 questions within the title or the request for this 10 minutes which I have. And when I looked at this, I thought, wow, that's a massively enormous scope. And I think it's probably normal to expect, and certainly in the sort of the 2 previous speakers, we've sort of seen a real sort of focus on private sector from a manufacturing perspective. So I thought I'd take a slightly different tack and talk a little bit outside of my sort of direct industry experience and talk about private sector more broadly, because I think there's obviously a lot more than just private sector as manufacturers. So next slide, please, Tim. So the thread, as just mentioned, so we've got the current role of the private sector. I'll describe a few different areas, and yeah, maybe I'll skip this one. Actually, go to the next one, please, Tim. But I thought maybe before getting into the different areas of the private sector, I think there's probably a few sort of elephants in the room, if you like, which really I think needs to be said up front, which are probably quite obvious, but I think they are underlying themes which really need to be very clearly on the table, and which also, in terms of motivations for engaging the private sector more broadly in malaria vector control and malaria elimination, need to be recognised and acknowledged and actually embraced. And of course, the first thing is, private sector is about making profit. That is, the primary driver. It's not the only driver, but it's certainly a primary one. But that making profit is sometimes seen as a bad thing. But actually, when you think about it, making profit basically means making the most out of a little. That's basically the motivator. Efficiency within private sector is a key thing. So being able to make a lot out of a little is a key driver. And when we think about resource-constrained environments, especially from the perspective of vector control or malaria or tropical disease elimination, that is obviously a fundamental thing, and it's a useful thing. So, that efficiency is key. The clarity is a strong supporter of efficiency. And I think those 2 elements of efficiency and clarity are really, obviously important as we talk across stakeholder groups in terms of really what we want to achieve. And the other thing which I put at the bottom here, which we obviously can't think about, is ultimately for businesses, for industry, our customers rule. They guide us in terms of what we do. We're here to serve customers. We need to make some money in the meantime, but ultimately what we do needs to give value to the organizations, the customers that are buying or using our products. And alongside that, there's also this element of public image. So most of the large organizations like to have good social image or public image, and they're quite proud of things that they get involved in terms of supporting humanitarian or community initiatives which for the health and well-being of the general public. So those themes are quite important. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I've got a bit of a lag my end, so I'm probably seeing it a little bit later than you are. But so I thought, as an initial approach, I thought let's think about the areas in malaria vector control where private sector in this more broad definition. So as I put it here, this is not just industry, like Bayer or Syngenta or Sumitomo or the other product suppliers, thinking about it more broadly in terms of how private sector is involved with malaria vector control. That's a sort of starting point. Of course, this isn't completely holistic, but it's really sort of I thought some sort of key pillars or key areas to consider. The first one there is obviously, we've already touched on that in the last, previous two presentations around product development and supply. And the sector, like the manufacturers of Bayer, Syngenta, Sumitomo, BASF, etc., the maintaining the availability of current tools, so maintaining registration dossiers, keeping product quality and dossiers up to date with not just from a WHO PQ perspective, but also from a local regulatory authority. That's an ongoing investment and an ongoing effort. But obviously the investment into innovation for new tools as well. That's obviously a key role for the private sector. And then the third point is, really a role as a stakeholder in terms of the contributing to this dialogue around the regulatory issues, but also supply chain issues. And Angus already just referred to some of the, from a regulatory reform and the HOOPIS and the PQ process, the industry input through the ITI process. Then if we think about from a product distribution perspective, ultimately, the products have to reach the end use. They're not necessarily always, it's not necessarily always a direct supply from manufacturers such as ourselves to programs. There's often intermediaries or sometimes intermediary organizations or distribution partners or agents involved in countries. And that is, I think there's an important element to think about here when we actually think about or talk about the definition of what is a vector control product. We always think about vector control products as those which have PQ listing. But of course, there are mosquito control products which may have local registrations for which a funding source or procurement avenue is not linked to a UN organization and for which probably should still have PQ, but not necessarily mandatory if there's private or local or domestic funding to support that. So in that situation, there might well be a completely different procurement chain, and the distribution partners become important because they are the bridge or the avenue towards what is a more diverse and complex customer base in countries. And that local warehousing and logistics is obviously fundamental in terms of reaching hard to reach communities. Then if we think about in the green column here, the kind of private sector organizations or industries which have operational activities in endemic countries, the mining, the agriculture and other types of industry, who really have a kind of a various areas of involvement, if you like. Primarily, if you like, it's about putting resources into vector control or public health activities in their areas of operation to protect their workforce, but also maintain business operations, but also sometimes extend that to communities. And on the fourth point, the column on the right-hand side, obviously there's elements around advocacy, image enhancement, and or contributing to company purpose, which is what I referred to on that last point in the previous slide around the public image being extremely important. So there's the opportunity for private sector to obviously contribute to not only advocacy for funding for further investment or continued investment into awareness and ongoing activities against malaria, but also supporting community public health from a CSR or a brand value or company brand value as a result. Next slide, please. So I thought about, okay, so those are the kind of the areas where they're currently, private sector is currently involved. But if we were to think about the challenges which are currently delaying elimination or challenges to achieving elimination in the APAC region specifically, there's challenges. Some of these challenges are listed on the left-hand side. I won't go through those, but I think I'm sure the audience here knows these even better in detail than I do. But there's some very specific things which are for the APAC region, which are specific challenges. There's also broader challenges which are common with other areas as well. But I sort of tried to approach this with this list of challenges on the left-hand side. So what's the so what? What is the implication of that? And therefore, what is the relevance of the private sector in terms of that so what, or what's the relevance? So there's various areas there, and I've used this beautiful color coding, which I apologize for because it was an attempt to try and match the columns in the previous slide with the elements which are reflected on this right-hand side. But you can see there's various themes around, continued investment in product development and innovation, support of advocacy activities which align with each of the different challenges, and elements around supply and distribution. But also, I'm getting a 2-minute warning which is flashing up on my screen, so I'll just hurry along a little bit. But I'll just maybe skip to the bottom one, which is around the private sector engaging in operations in malarious areas, and this concept of first doing no harm. And obviously, when they're setting up operations, if it's mining or agriculture or others, I think there's obviously there's a challenge there of not being aware of what contributes to increased malaria transmission. So this element of first doing no harm is a fundamental. But obviously, the second part is actually what actions they can take to protect populations, both their workers and their communities, in those areas once malaria transmission is occurring. Next slide, please. So then I took the sort of continued theme, if you like, or continuation with the color coding, which the awful color coding, and I so the activity of the private sector and the challenges and hurdles, and then sort of it's a continuation of the previous table or the previous slide, but really it's about on the right hand side, if we focus in this remaining time on the right hand side in terms of how to motivate private sector to do more in each of those areas. And I think there's various areas or various topics in this which need to appeal to some of those things which I highlighted in the very beginning around ability to get return on investment, ability to enhance brand image, ability to contribute to perhaps company mission. But there's various things in there in terms of, I think most private sector organizations are, from an industry perspective and a manufacturer's perspective, certainly an interest in innovating, but obviously getting a return on investment. There are obviously time elements, there's cost elements to that. The PQ system and versus the local regulatory system is an important thing to take into account. I think one of the earlier comments or questions from Dr. Sharma around availability of products, just because a product has a PQ listing doesn't necessarily mean it has a local registration, and sometimes vice versa. And then obviously there's things from a regulatory framework which can be done. There's a fine balance to be achieved between supporting data protection and supporting the primary innovators, but obviously encouraging a competitive market, which is obviously in the best interest of affordability. I think in terms of the orange line there, providing or helping organisations see brand equity and being part of the conversation and part of the advocacy initiatives for resources, I think that's obviously important. On the distribution, I think there's the age-old challenge of, from a manufacturer perspective at least, it's around sustainability of demand. Forecasting and managing supply chain is important. That's often very difficult. So perhaps sometimes there's a need to look at some products which are used for malaria vector control needs, what opportunities are there, what kind of dialogue can happen to see where there's similar use for such products which might flatten out or maintain some demand in other markets, and not just have a malaria unique type of malaria vector control unique product. I think there's various other elements. I'm conscious of time, but I think most product suppliers, for example, on the second last line there, are really interested in supporting training and capacity development where there's expertise to do so. I think obviously the familiarity we've all gained under COVID with the use of webinars and this kind of forum or platform is obviously makes some of that quite easy, but you can't replace hands-on practical experience. And I think maybe on the last one, in terms of this industry or private sector being involved in operations in malarious areas, there's an element of education and support. The mining and the agriculture sectors don't have familiarity with challenges of vector control. They don't understand that. So what can we do to help them understand the impact of what they do? Maybe the next slide, because I'm probably over time, but the next slide is my last slide, which is really a little bit of a kind of wrap up, because I think there's actually, to me, I think there's actually good news. I mean, to me, the message is getting out there. There's fantastic initiatives. There's the M2030, which you're familiar with very well in the APAC region. The recent publication last month from the Business Alliance Against Malaria around the investment case and why businesses should fight malaria. Great advocacy document for getting the private sector, broader elements of the private sector interested in contributing to malaria prevention. On the left-hand side, I think, I guess this has come up in some of the questions earlier. There are, from an innovation perspective, there are several new modes of action on the horizon. And if you look at the WHO PQ pipeline website, which has been published launched this year, there's 3 new modes of action, well, not brand new, but new for vector control and public health. 3 new modes of action in the IRS horizon. Longer term, if you sort of delve through some of the documentation from IBC, it's quite clear that there's other modes of action in insecticides in the longer term as well. There's also new intervention classes under development, which you can see through the VCAG process. So there's, honestly, I think it's to me, the vector control product pipeline has never been so good. But of course, the big challenge is it might reach PQ, but does it necessarily meet a local or achieve a local registration in a country? And that local registration in the country is often sort of the final challenge from a manufacturer's perspective. And that's really about justifying the investment for the local registration based on a sort of sustainable demand and sales which are expected in that country. And maybe just the last point on the left-hand side, I think there's, what's also really exciting is seeing some of the innovations which are happening in these enabling technologies, application equipment developments from the likes of GOISPA, fantastic spatial intelligence and mapping systems which are becoming available now as well. So that was my last slide. I'm conscious of time. I guess I probably haven't provided any answers, but it was really just a bit of thought-provoking to lead into the workshop perhaps. But I guess to me the message is, there's all kinds of areas the private sector can be involved. Really need to hone in and identify the motivators, and some of those are quite clear. But I think for the most part, most people are really willing and interested to be more engaged. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. That's a very interesting presentation. I hope audience will find, particularly the tables that we have seen, that Justin's gave a very good his perspective and experience in ramping up that kind of processes. So I hope those will be when we go into the group work discussion. So yes, please continue the questions. Apologies if we couldn't do live Q&As because of the interest of times, and but please encourage to be inserting your questions to Justin or any of our speakers in the chat box or Q&A, but please do in Q&A because it's much easier to respond. We are a bit of over time of our agenda, but just want to make an announcement that evening we'll be breaking up into 2 groups. So here, in terms of explanation of mechanics, we have the webinar participants and the panelists in Zoom. So we're using this webinar platform, but in order to do breakout, we have to switch into Zoom meeting. So right after this, we're going to have a 10-minute breaks. And before that, my colleague, Ms. Wulan will be sending out a new link to join into the Zoom meeting. So you will have to leave this platform, the Zoom webinar, and then you will need to rejoin with the new link that has been shared to you. So we'll have a 10-minute breaks, and look out for that email. So we will be reconvening in 10 minutes exactly, and I will explain when we regroup in the Zoom meeting. I will explain how we will be process for the group board discussion. So thank you very much, Mark, Angus, and Justin, for your excellent presentation. It really gave us a food for thoughts for evening group works, and I hope we will hope to hear some of the responses and advice from the country partners and what they have to say about these processes. So thank you very much for joining, and have a nice coffee break.